My hands wouldn't stop shaking. The old, leather-bound Bible felt heavy and cold in my lap, a relic from a war I thought I'd lost. The air in my dad's silent, empty house was thick with dust and 20 years of unspoken words. He'd been gone for 3 months, and I was finally forcing myself to sort through the last of his things, a duty I'd been dreading. I ran my fingers over the cracked spine, remembering how this same book had sat on his nightstand, untouched for years, a prop in a life that felt like a lie. A bitter taste filled my mouth. I almost threw it into the donation box without opening it. But something, a stubborn, foolish flicker of hope, maybe, made me flip it open. The pages, thin as onion skin, whispered as they turned. And then I saw it. A single, folded sheet of lined notebook paper, tucked right in the middle of the Book of Psalms. My breath hitched. I knew his handwriting instantly, that slanted, rushed scrawl I'd seen on grocery lists and work orders. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a frantic, painful rhythm. This was it. The one thing I'd given up praying for. The one thing I told God was impossible. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper. The date at the top was just 2 weeks before the stroke that took him. And the first words were, "My dearest Kyle, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I never found the courage to say this to your face. I am so sorry." The room tilted. Tears I didn't know I had left blurred the words on the page. For 2 decades, I had been convinced my father died without apologizing, without ever acknowledging the wreckage he left behind. I had built my entire life on the foundation of that bitterness. And now, with one hidden note, that foundation was crumbling to dust. But to understand how I got here, I need to take you back to where it all began. I was 10 years old the last time I believed my dad was a hero. We lived in a small, blue-sided house in Canton, Ohio, and he worked at the steel plant. He'd come home smelling of sweat and metal, and he'd swing me up onto his shoulders like I weighed nothing. My name is Kyle, and I thought my dad, Mike, hung the moon. My mom, Linda, was the quiet, steady one who made sure my socks matched and my lunch was packed. She was the one who prayed with me before bed, her voice soft and sure. Dad didn't come to church with us most Sundays, saying he was too tired, but he'd always ask what the sermon was about over pot roast dinner. The change didn't happen all at once. It was a slow leak, like air from a tire. He started working later. The smell of sweat was sometimes covered by the sharp, sweet smell of beer. His laugh, which used to fill the whole living room, became quieter, and then it stopped altogether. He and Mom started having conversations in hushed, tense voices behind their bedroom door, conversations that always ended with Mom crying. I was 12 when I came home from school on a Tuesday and found Mom sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale and splotchy. She wasn't crying anymore. She just looked empty. "Your father," she said, her voice strangely flat, "isn't going to be living with us anymore." She didn't give me details, not then. Just that he'd met someone else, a woman from the next town over, and he was leaving. It felt like a physical blow, like someone had kicked the air right out of my lungs. The man I'd idolized had chosen a different life, and in doing so, he was throwing ours away. The day he moved out, he packed his things into a few cardboard boxes and his old pickup truck. He knelt down in front of me on the front porch. His eyes were red. "Kyle," he said, his voice rough, "I love you. This isn't your fault." I didn't say anything. I just stared at a crack in the wooden porch floor, my throat tight with a hot, angry hurt. He waited for a moment, then stood up, patted my shoulder awkwardly, and got in his truck. I watched him drive away, and I made a promise to myself, right there on that porch. I would never forgive him. Before I continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your location and what time it is where you are in the comments. It means the world to me to know who's hearing this story. The years that followed were hard. Mom aged 10 years and 2. She went back to work, her hands getting rough from cleaning offices at night. We stopped going to church for a while. What was the point of praying to a God who let families fall apart? My anger at my dad was a constant companion, a heavy stone I carried in my chest. He'd call sometimes, his voice tinny on the answering machine. "Hey, it's Dad. Just calling to see how you're doing." I never called him back. He sent birthday cards with $20 bills tucked inside. I threw them away, the money and all. He tried to pick me up for a weekend once, but I hid in my closet until his truck pulled away from the curb. My silence was my weapon, and I used it with all the fury a teenage boy can muster. I heard through the grapevine, a cousin, I think, that his new life hadn't worked out. The woman left him. He moved into a small apartment alone. A small, vicious part of me was glad. He'd made his bed. Now he could lie in it. My mom, to her credit, never badmouthed him to me. She'd just sigh and say, "Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to get sick, Kyle." But I was young, and the poison felt like justice. By the time I was in college, the sharp edges of my anger had worn down into a dull, constant ache. I started going to church again, mostly because a girl I liked invited me. The messages about forgiveness made me squirm in my seat. It felt like the pastor was looking right at me. I'd think about my dad, living alone in that apartment, and I'd feel a twinge of something. Not pity, but maybe curiosity. What was he thinking now? Did he ever regret it? But my pride was a fortress, and I was its only guard. I never reached out. Then, 3 months ago, the call came. It was a hospital social worker. My father had a massive stroke. He was alone when it happened. By the time a neighbor found him, it was too late. There was no dramatic deathbed scene. No chance for a final, cinematic reconciliation. He was just gone. The finality of it was a different kind of blow. The door I had kept locked for 20 years was now permanently, irrevocably sealed shut. He had died, and he had never apologized. At the funeral, a small, sad affair in a dusty funeral home chapel, I stood by his casket and looked at his face. It was him, but it wasn't. All the lines of life and disappointment were smoothed away. I expected to feel triumph, or at least a sense of closure. Instead, I felt a hollow, devastating emptiness. The stone of anger I'd been carrying for so long had suddenly vanished, and I was left off balance, falling into a void I didn't know how to fill. I had spent my life defining myself as the son my father left, and now, with him gone, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. And that's how I ended up in his quiet, lonely house, tasked with the horrible chore of erasing his life, box by box. I was angry at him for dying, angry at God for letting it end this way, and angriest of all at myself for wasting so much time. I worked mechanically, packing up cheap dishes and worn-out flannel shirts, the scent of his cheap aftershave still lingering in the closets. I was numb, going through the motions, convinced that this was the end of the story, a story of betrayal and bitterness with no redemption in sight. Until I picked up that Bible. And now, as I sit here on the floor of his bedroom, the dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sun, this single piece of paper in my hand changes everything. The apology I thought I'd never have is here, written in his own hand. But as I start to read past those first few staggering sentences, my blood runs cold. Because his letter doesn't say what I expected. It reveals a truth so much more painful and so much more beautiful than I ever could have imagined. The words on the page swam in front of my eyes. I had to blink several times, forcing the tears away so I could see. My dad's handwriting was messy, like he'd been in a hurry or his hand was shaking. My dearest Kyle, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and I never found the courage to say this to your face. I am so sorry. Sorry for leaving. Sorry for the silence. Sorry for every birthday and Christmas I missed. I thought I was chasing some kind of happiness, but all I found was a deeper kind of lonely. I read that first paragraph over and over. A deeper kind of lonely. The phrase echoed in the empty room. This wasn't the triumphant confession of a villain. It was the weary sigh of a broken man. The anger I'd worn like a shield for 20 years felt suddenly heavy and useless. The truth is, I was a coward, the letter continued. I was ashamed. Ashamed of what I'd done to your mom, to you, to our family. Every time I picked up the phone to call you, I'd picture your face, that last look you gave me on the porch, and I'd put it back down. I thought you were better off without me. I thought my money, sent in those stupid cards, was all I had left to give. I was wrong. I was so wrong. A hot tear finally escaped and splashed onto the paper, smudging the blue ink. I quickly wiped it away, a stupid protectiveness surging in me. This was all I had left of him, and I was already damaging it. I could feel the walls around my heart, walls I'd spent my whole life building, beginning to crack. I started going to church again about a year ago, he wrote. A little church downtown no one knows about. I sat in the back row and left before the last song. The pastor talked about the prodigal son. I'd heard it 100 times before, but that day, it felt like he was talking just to me. I wasn't the son who came back begging. I was the one who was too proud, too scared to even start the journey home. I realized I'd been waiting for a feeling, for a moment when I felt fixed enough to come back to you. But that day never came. I leaned my head back against his dusty bed frame, the Bible still open in my lap. My dad in a church, trying to find his way back? It was an image I couldn't quite picture. The man I'd constructed in my head, the selfish, unfeeling monster, was dissolving, replaced by this stranger who was just as lost as I was. I'm not writing this to make excuses, the letter went on, his pen pressing hard into the paper. There are none. I made my choices, and I have to live with the consequences. Or I guess I had to die with them. But I need you to know this, Kyle. I need you to know that I loved you. I never stopped. You were my boy. The biggest regret of my life isn't the divorce or the failed relationships that came after. It's the thousands of days I lived without hearing your voice. I'm so sorry I chose my pride over my son. A sob ripped out of me, a raw, ugly sound in the quiet house. It was the confession I'd craved. It was the acknowledgement of the pain. But it was too late. He was gone. The chance to tell him it was okay, to say, I forgive you, to maybe even hug him. That chance was buried 6 feet under. The hollowness I felt at his funeral returned, but now it was filled with a new, agonizing pain. The pain of a missed opportunity, so vast it took my breath away. I read to the end of the page. I don't know if you're a man of faith now. I hope so. It's the only thing that's given me any peace these last few months. I've been praying for you every day, praying that you're happy, that you're a better man than I ever was. And I've been praying for the courage to give you this letter. I'm hiding it in my Bible, the one my own father gave me. Maybe it's fitting. If you find it, it means God gave me the courage in the end, even if it had to be like this. I love you, son. Always have. Always will. Dad. The letter ended there. I sat on the floor for a long time, just holding that piece of paper. The sun dipped lower, casting long, sad shadows across the room. The dust settled around me. I felt utterly spent. The story wasn't over. This letter wasn't the end. It was a beginning I didn't know how to start. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was my mom. I let it go to voicemail. How could I possibly explain this to her? How could I tell her that the man who broke her heart had spent his last days in a back pew, praying for his son? I carefully folded the letter and slipped it back into the Bible. I couldn't deal with the rest of his things. Not now. I stood up, my joints stiff, and walked out of the house, locking the door behind me. The drive home was a blur. I walked into my own apartment, the silence there feeling different than the silence in his house. His was empty. Mine was now full of 1,000 new questions, full of a grief I didn't recognize, full of the echoing words of a dead man's apology. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the words of the letter playing on a loop in my mind. I loved you. I never stopped. I was a coward. The anger was still there, but it was confused now, with nowhere to land. Who was I supposed to be angry at? The ghost of a man who was already punishing himself more than I ever could? The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in a very long time. I got on my knees beside my bed. I didn't know what to pray. The words felt stuck. All I could manage was a choked, God, what do I do with this? There was no voice from heaven, no sudden feeling of peace, just the same heavy confusion. But for the first time, the confusion felt like it had a purpose. It wasn't just a dead end anymore. A few days later, I found myself driving across town. I didn't even really decide to go. I just started driving. I pulled into the parking lot of the little downtown church he'd mentioned in his letter. It was a simple, red brick building with a white steeple. It looked kind. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, my hands gripping the steering wheel. What was I doing here? Was I trying to find some trace of him? Was I trying to understand the peace he said he'd found? Finally, I got out and walked to the front doors. They were unlocked. I stepped inside into the cool, dim quiet. The sanctuary was small, with plain stained glass windows that cast colored light on the wooden pews. It smelled of old hymnals and lemon polish. And then I saw him. An old man was slowly walking down the center aisle, humming softly to himself. He turned, saw me, and smiled a gentle, surprised smile. Well, hello there, he said, his voice warm and raspy. I'm Pastor Joe. Can I help you with something? My throat was tight. I couldn't form the words. How did you ask a stranger if he knew you're dead, a strange father? I just stood there, frozen. His eyes softened, as if he could see the storm raging inside me. He took a step closer, his head tilted. "You know," he said quietly, "you look familiar. You have the same eyes as a man who started coming here about a year ago. A quiet fellow. Mike." Hearing my dad's name in this place, from this stranger's mouth, shattered the last of my composure. My shoulders slumped, and I looked down at the floor. Pastor Joe didn't say anything else. He just waited. When I finally looked up, my vision was blurred with tears. "He was my father," I whispered. Pastor Joe's expression shifted from curiosity to a deep, knowing sadness. He nodded slowly. "I was so sorry to hear about his passing. Come," he said, gesturing to a pew. "Sit with me for a minute." I sat down, the wooden bench hard beneath me. He sat beside me, not too close, giving me space. "He talked about you," Pastor Joe said softly. Not by name. He'd just say, "I have a son." He carried a weight of regret for you that was immense. He prayed for you every single time he was here. "He wrote me a letter," I said, my voice rough. "I found it after he was gone." "Ah," the pastor said, a sad smile touching his lips. "I'm glad." He talked about writing it. He was so afraid you wouldn't want to hear from him. He was afraid of causing you more pain. We sat in silence for a moment, the truth of my dad's fear settling between us. The monster was gone. In his place was just a man, a flawed, scared, regretful man. "I don't know what to do now," I admitted, the confession feeling both terrifying and relieving. "I spent my whole life being angry at him. And now, I don't know who I am without it." Pastor Joe placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "That, my boy," he said, "is where the real work begins." He stood up and walked towards his office, then paused and looked back at me. "Mike mentioned you once, a long time ago, had a favorite toy, a little green tractor you took everywhere." I stared at him, a memory I hadn't thought of in decades flashing in my mind. "My John Deere tractor. I'd love that thing." How did he know? He remembered that, Pastor Joe said. He held on to that memory. He said it was one of the good ones. And with that, he disappeared into his office, leaving me alone in the quiet sanctuary. I put my head in my hands, and the tears came freely now. They weren't tears of anger anymore. They were tears of grief for the time we lost, for the father I never got to know, and for the little boy with a green tractor who just wanted his dad. The foundation of my life wasn't just cracked, it was gone. And I was standing in the rubble, completely lost, with no idea how to start building something new. But as a shaft of light from a window fell across my feet, I realized the one thing I hadn't felt in 20 years was finally starting to break through the confusion. It was a tiny, fragile seed, but it was there. It was hope. That tiny seed of hope felt terrifying. For so long, my identity had been built on being the wounded one, the son who was left. Letting go of that anger felt like dismantling myself, brick by painful brick. I started going to Pastor Joe's little downtown church on Sunday mornings. I sat in the back row, just like my dad had. I didn't sing the songs, and I barely listened to the sermons. I just sat there, letting the silence and the space work on me. It was like physical therapy for a soul that had been crippled for decades. It hurt, and it was slow, and most days I couldn't see any progress at all. I avoided my mom. Her voicemails piled up. "Just checking in, honey. Do you need help with your dad's house?" How could I tell her I'd found a letter that changed everything? How could I explain my sudden, shaky interest in God without her thinking I was having a breakdown? She had built a good life for herself after he left. She'd remarried a kind, quiet man named Bill who fixed her car and made her laugh. She didn't need my dad's ghost stirring up old pain. But the letter was a live wire in my pocket, burning a hole through my everyday life. I'd be in a meeting at work, and I'd suddenly hear his words in my head. I was too proud, too scared to even start the journey home. I was living in the exact same prison he had described. After 3 weeks of this, I knew I had to go back to the house. I couldn't leave it as a shrine to my confusion. I drove there on a Saturday morning, the late spring sun doing its best to cheer up the faded blue siding. I brought boxes and trash bags, my resolve feeling as flimsy as the cardboard. I started in the living room, packing away knickknacks that held no meaning for me. A ceramic eagle, a stack of old National Geographic magazines. It was easier than starting in his bedroom, which still felt sacred because of the Bible. I worked for hours, the monotony a strange comfort. Then, in the back of the hall closet, behind a stack of yellowed towels, I found a cardboard box labeled Kyle in my dad's handwriting. My heart started that familiar, frantic pounding. I pulled the box out and sat on the floor right there in the hallway. I lifted the flaps, half expecting, I don't know what, rejections of my childhood, but it wasn't that at all. On top was my third-grade science fair project, a wobbly volcano made of papier-mâché, now collapsed on one side. Beneath that was a stack of my report cards. He had every one, from kindergarten through 6th grade, the year he left. He'd kept the Little League team photo from the year I was 7, my smile gap-toothed and proud in my uniform that was too big. There was a construction paper Father's Day card I'd made, with a crayon drawing of the two of us fishing. Inside, in my messy kid writing, it said, "To the best dad in the whole world." I stared at the card, my breath catching. He'd kept this. For over 20 years, through a divorce and moving houses and a failed life, he'd kept this stupid crayon card. The man in the letter wasn't just words on a page. He was real. He was the man who had treasured this evidence that his son once thought he hung the moon. And at the very bottom of the box, wrapped in an old sweatshirt, was the little green John Deere tractor. I picked it up. The plastic was cool in my hand. The green was faded, and one of the back wheels was cracked, but it was there. Pastor Joe's words came back to me. He remembered that. He said it was one of the good ones. I squeezed the tractor until the plastic edges dug into my palm. This was proof. Proof that his love wasn't a lie he made up at the end. It was a real thing that had existed, a thing he had clung to long after I had let go of it. I didn't know how long I sat there, holding that tractor. The anger I'd nursed for so long was finally, completely, gone. In its place was a grief so profound it felt oceanic. I wasn't grieving the dad I lost at 12. I was grieving the dad I could have had back at 20, or 25, or 30. I was grieving all the years we both wasted, trapped by our own pride and fear. I put the tractor in my pocket. I packed the rest of the Kyle box into my car to take home. It was no longer a box of his junk. It was a box of my history, a history I'd only known one side of. That night, I called my mom. "Kyle, honey, I've been so worried. Are you okay?" Her voice was laced with concern. I'm getting there, Mom," I said, my own voice sounding strange and raw. "I found something at Dad's house. A letter. He wrote me a letter." The silence on the other end of the line was so deep I thought the call had dropped. "Mom, I'm here," she said softly. I could hear the caution in her voice, the old defenses going up. "I don't know how to say this, but he was sorry, Mom. Really, truly sorry. He was going to church. He was praying for me." The words tumbled out in a rush. He kept a box of my old stuff. My report cards. That tractor I loved. I heard her take a sharp, shaky breath. "Oh, Kyle, I'm not telling you to make you feel bad," I said quickly, "or to forgive him. I needed you to know. The story we told ourselves about him. It wasn't the whole story." She was quiet for another long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion, but it wasn't anger. It was something closer to relief. "You know, after he left, I prayed for years that God would change his heart. I finally gave up. I figured God had said no." She let out a small, broken sigh. "I guess sometimes God's answers just take a lot longer than we want them to." Her words settled over me. God's answers just take a lot longer than we want them to. My mom's prayers, offered up in tears at this very kitchen table, had been answered in a back row church pew 2 decades later. The timeline was all wrong, but the answer was right there, hidden in a Bible. I went to see Pastor Joe the next day. I told him about the box, about the tractor, about the conversation with my mom. He listened, nodding slowly. "Grief is the price we pay for love, Kyle," he said. "You're finally grieving because you're finally letting yourself believe you were loved. That's a holy thing. But what do I do now?" I asked, the question feeling like the central plea of my life. "He's gone. I can't tell him I forgive him. I can't get those years back." Pastor Joe leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Forgiveness isn't for him, son. It's for you. And as for the past, you can't change it. But you can stop letting it dictate your future." He looked at me, his eyes kind. "Your father started his journey home. It looks like you found his map. The question is, where will you go from here?" I left his office with that question hanging in the air. I had the apology. I had the proof of his love. I had even, in a way, started to forgive him. But it all felt unfinished, like a sentence without a period. That night, I took the letter out of the Bible and read it one more time. And that's when I saw it, a sentence I'd read before, but had skimmed over in my emotional storm. A sentence that changed everything yet again. I've been praying for you every day, praying that you're happy, that you're a better man than I ever was. I was so focused on the apology, on my own pain, that I'd missed his deepest wish for me. He wanted me to be happy. He wanted me to be a better man. And sitting there, surrounded by the boxes of his broken life, I realized with a jolt that I wasn't being a better man. I was still letting his worst choices define my life. Being a better man meant breaking the chain. It meant choosing a different path. But how? The answer came to me not as a voice, but as a quiet, terrifying conviction. A piece of the story was still missing. There was one person who held a key to my dad's lost years, the one person I had sworn I would never, ever seek out. I had to find the woman he left us for. The thought was like a live wire in my brain, shocking and undeniable. I have to find her. The other woman. The one whose name I'd refused to learn for 20 years. The villainess in the story I'd told myself. Her name was Janet. I knew that much from the hushed, angry arguments I'd overheard as a kid. Janet. It was a plain name, and I'd made it into a monster. For a week, I fought the impulse. It felt like a betrayal of my mom, even though she'd been the one to suggest, in her own way, that God's timing was mysterious. It felt like digging up a grave that was better left sealed. What could she possibly tell me? More details about my dad's failures? More proof that he was a liar? I had his letter. I had his box of memories. Did I really need to hear from the woman who helped break us? But Pastor Joe's question echoed in my mind. Where will you go from here? I was stuck. The forgiveness I felt for my dad was real, but it was a quiet, sad thing in a silent room. It hadn't set me free. I was still the boy on the porch, watching the truck drive away. To be a better man, I had to stop being that boy. And somehow, I knew Janet was part of the path forward. Finding her was easier than I thought it would be. My dad wasn't a tech-savvy man, but in a kitchen drawer filled with takeout menus and dead batteries, I found an old, worn address book. My hands trembled as I flipped through it. There, under J, was her name, Janet Miller, and an address in the next town over, just like my mom had said all those years ago. I didn't call. I knew if I heard her voice, I'd lose my nerve. The following Tuesday, I took a personal day from work. I drove the 20 minutes to a quiet, middle-class neighborhood of modest ranch houses and well-kept lawns. It was so normal, so ordinary. It wasn't the den of iniquity my childhood imagination had constructed. I sat in my car across the street from her house, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. What was I doing here? What was I going to say? Hi, you probably don't remember me, but you destroyed my family, and I was wondering if we could chat? This was a terrible, stupid idea. I put the car in drive, ready to flee. Just then, the front door of the house opened. A woman walked out, carrying a watering can. She was in her late 50s, maybe early 60s. She had short, graying hair and wore jeans and a simple t-shirt. She looked tired. She looked like someone's grandma. She began watering the petunias in a window box, her movements slow and methodical. This was her. The phantom. The home wrecker. She was watering flowers. I turned the car off. I had to do this. I got out and started walking across the street. She heard my footsteps on the pavement and looked up, her expression politely curious. "Can I help you?" she asked. Her voice was softer than I expected. My mouth was dry as dust. "Janet Miller?" Her polite curiosity shifted into wariness. "Yes." I stopped at the edge of her lawn, keeping a distance between us. "My name is Kyle," I said. "Kyle Mitchell. Mike Mitchell was my father." The watering can slipped from her hand, hitting the grass with a dull thud and spilling water over her sneakers. All the color drained from her face. She looked like she'd seen a ghost. For a long, awful moment, she just stared at me, her hand fluttering to her throat. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh my. I'm sorry to just show up like this," I said, the words feeling inadequate and clumsy. I found a letter my dad wrote after he died, and I had some questions. I wasn't angry. I wasn't accusatory. I was just a man, standing on a stranger's lawn, feeling utterly lost. Janet recovered slightly, bending to pick up the watering can with unsteady hands. She didn't invite me in. She just stood there, looking at me, and I saw a deep, old sadness in her eyes. "He's gone, isn't he?" she said. It wasn't really a question. I read the obituary. I nodded. "A few months ago." She let out a long, shaky breath. I'm sorry for your loss, Kyle. The formality of it was jarring. Thank you, I managed to say. We stood in silence for what felt like an eternity. The suburban street was quiet except for the distant sound of a lawnmower. Why are you here? She finally asked, her voice low. I looked down at my shoes, then back at her. I need to understand. I spent my whole life being so angry. And his letter, it changed everything. It showed me a man I never knew. I guess I thought you could show me more of him. A bitter, sad smile touched her lips. The man you never knew was the only man I knew, she said. The happy, fun Mike was long gone by the time I met him. Her words hit me with unexpected force. What do you mean? She looked past me, down the street, as if seeing into the past. Your father was a profoundly unhappy man when I met him at that plant. He felt like a failure. He felt trapped. He talked about you all the time, you know. His boy, Kyle. He carried your third-grade school picture in his wallet. She looked back at me, her eyes glistening. Our relationship, it wasn't some great romance. It was two lonely, messed up people making a terrible mistake. It was over almost as soon as it began. I felt the ground shift under my feet. This wasn't the story. The story was that he left us for her. For a better life. He left us for you, I said, the old narrative fighting to survive. He left, she corrected gently, but firmly. And he came here. But he never left you. He was haunted by you. He was miserable here. He drank too much. He'd sit in that chair. She pointed to a living room window and stare out at nothing for hours. He was here for less than a year. He couldn't forgive himself. I couldn't live with the ghost of the family he'd destroyed. I asked him to leave. The pieces were crashing together, forming a picture I never could have imagined. He didn't ride off into the sunset. He drove into a deeper darkness. His affair wasn't a triumph. It was a symptom of his brokenness. He wasn't the villain who got the girl. He was a lost soul who lost everything, twice. I think I hated you because it was easier than hating him, I admitted, the confession leaving me feeling exposed. She nodded, as if she'd always known. I know, and I'm sorry for the part one played in your pain. I've had to live with that, too. For 20 years. She wrapped her arms around herself. He tried to reach out to you a few times, after he moved into his apartment. Did you know that? I shook my head, my throat tight. He did. He'd get your number from an old friend, dial it, and hang up. He wrote you dozens of letters he never sent. He was so convinced he didn't deserve your forgiveness that he never gave you the chance to give it. She looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than sadness in her face. It was pity. For him, and for me. We were the same, you and I. What do you mean? We both loved Mike Mitchell. And we both let our pride and our pain keep us from him until it was too late. Her words were a spear to my heart. She was right. My righteous anger had been just as effective a wall as his shame. We had been partners in a tragic dance of silence. I didn't know what to say. The mission I'd come on felt complete, and yet I was left with a whole new kind of ache. Thank you, I said, my voice rough, for telling me this. She just nodded, picking up her watering can again, a clear signal that the conversation was over. I had taken enough of her peace for one day. I turned and walked back to my car. I didn't look back. As I drove away, the monster named Janet was gone forever. In her place was just another wounded person, another soul caught in the ripple effect of my father's sin. The chain of hurt was longer and more complicated than I had ever allowed myself to see. I drove straight to the church. It was unlocked, as always. I walked down the center aisle, past the back row where my dad sat, and I slid into the very first pew. I put my head in my hands and I wept. I wept for my dad's loneliness. I wept for Janet's regret. I wept for my mom's answered prayers that came too late. And I wept for the boy I was, who had carried a burden he was never meant to carry. When the tears finally subsided, I felt hollowed out and clean. The whole story was finally out. There were no more secrets, no more villains, no more monsters. There was just brokenness and grace. I looked up at the simple wooden cross at the front of the church. For the first time, I understood it in a way I never had before. It wasn't just about forgiveness for sins. It was about ending the chain. It was about taking the pain and the shame and the pride and letting it die, so something new could live. I had found my father's letter. I had found his box of memories. I had found Janet. I had pieced together the truth. But as I sat there in the quiet, I realized one devastating, liberating truth. The journey wasn't about finding my father. It was about finding myself. And the man I found was still angry, still hurt, and still so lost. But for the first time, he was ready to be found. The only question that remained was, what was I going to do with him? The silence in the church offered no easy answer. Only the weight of the choice now mine to make. The silence in the church wasn't empty anymore. It was full. It was heavy with the truth I'd been running from my whole life. My father wasn't a monster. He was a man. A flawed, scared, broken man who loved me as well as his own damaged heart would allow. And I wasn't just an innocent victim. I was a man who had chosen to build a fortress out of his pain, and then had chosen to live inside it, alone. I left the church that day feeling like a stranger in my own skin. The story I'd told myself, the one that had structured my world for 20 years, was gone. I felt unmoored. I drove home, the little green tractor still in my pocket, a tangible anchor to a past that now meant something completely different. For the next few weeks, I moved through my life like a ghost. I went to work. I paid my bills. I even went on a date with a nice woman from my office. But I spent the whole night nodding and smiling while my mind was 1,000 miles away, sifting through the wreckage of my old life. The anger was gone, but what was left? A vast, quiet sadness, and a question that wouldn't leave me alone. Now what? Pastor Joe had said forgiveness was for me. I thought finding the letter, understanding the whole story, would be the key that unlocked that door. But the door was still closed. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that intellectual forgiveness, understanding why someone did what they did, was different from hard forgiveness. The first was a map. The second was the actual, difficult journey. The trigger came from an unexpected place. My mom called. She and Bill were cleaning out their garage and found my old baseball glove from Little League. Did I want it? When I got to their house, she handed me the glove. It was stiff with age, the leather cracked. I slipped my hand inside, and a memory, sharp and clear, flashed in my mind. I was 9. My dad was teaching me how to catch a pop fly in our backyard. I was terrified of the ball. He stood behind me, his arms around me, his hands guiding my glove. "Watch it all the way in, Kyle," he'd said, his voice calm in my ear. "Don't be afraid. I've got you." I'd forgotten that. I'd buried it under a mountain of later memories of slamming doors and silence. But in that moment, in my mom's tidy garage, the memory was so vivid I could almost smell his aftershave. He was a good teacher, my mom said softly, watching me. She wasn't talking about baseball. I looked at her, this woman who had every right to be bitter, who had carried our broken family on her back for years. "How did you do it, Mom?" I asked, my voice cracking. "How did you move on? How did you not hate him?" She leaned against an old workbench, her expression thoughtful. "Oh, I hated him for a while, Kyle. Don't let anyone tell you that's a sin. It's a feeling. It's what you do with it that matters." She folded her arms. One day, I was just so tired. Tired of carrying the weight of what he'd done. The anger was exhausting. It was like drinking acid and expecting him to die. She smiled a little. "I told you that once, remember?" I nodded. I finally realized that forgiving him wasn't about saying what he did was okay. It was about setting down the burden. It was a choice I made for me, so I could have a life. So I could be open to meeting someone like Bill. She looked at me, her eyes full of a mother's fierce love. "The forgiveness I gave your father was the cheapest gift I ever gave myself. It cost me nothing but my misery, and it gave me everything. It cost me nothing but my misery." Her words echoed in the silent car on the drive home. That's what I was still clutching onto. My misery. It had become my identity. Letting it go felt like a betrayal of the 12-year-old boy on the porch. But holding on to it was a betrayal of the man I was supposed to be. That night, I did the hardest thing I have ever done. I took out a piece of paper and a pen. I wasn't going to write a letter to a ghost. I was going to write a letter to myself. To that 12-year-old boy. "Dear Kyle," I wrote. "It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be hurt. What your dad did was wrong. It broke our family. You have every right to those feelings." Just writing those words felt like releasing a pressure valve. I was finally validating my own pain, instead of just using it as a weapon. "But," I continued, my pen scratching in the quiet room, "we have carried this for long enough. The man who did that is gone. He was sorry. He was more sorry than we ever knew. He loved us. He kept our report cards and our stupid crayon drawings. He was just a man, as broken as we are. It is time to set the burden down. It is time to forgive him. Not for him. For us." I signed it. "The man you became, who is finally ready to let you heal. I folded the letter and put it in the box with my other childhood things. I didn't need to keep it. The act of writing it had carved the words onto my heart. A strange peace settled over me. It wasn't a happy, everything is fixed peace. It was a quiet, weary peace, the kind you feel after a long and brutal battle. The war was over. The next Sunday, I went to church again. This time, I didn't slink into the back row. I walked halfway down and sat. When the music started, I didn't just stand there. I opened the hymnal. I didn't know the tune, and my voice was rough and off-key, but I sang. The words were about grace and mercy, and for the first time, they weren't just nice ideas. They were real. They were the air I was breathing. After the service, Pastor Joe found me, a warm smile on his face. "I see a difference in you, Kyle," he said. "The storm has passed." "The storm has passed," I agreed. I think I finally forgave him." "Praise God," he said softly. "That's a miracle." "It feels like one," I said. And it did. It felt like a weight had been lifted that I never thought I could put down. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in decades. The world looked different. The colors seemed brighter. The future felt like a possibility, not just a continuation of the past. I walked into my apartment, the silence now friendly and warm. I had done it. I had reached the end of the journey. The story was complete. And then I saw it. Sitting on my coffee table, where I had left it after showing it to my mom, was my dad's Bible, the one that held the letter, the source of all this change. I walked over and picked it up, feeling the familiar, cracked leather. A sense of deep gratitude washed over me. This book, this object, had been the catalyst for my freedom. I opened it, not to the book of Psalms where the letter had been, but to the front cover. I don't know why. I guess I just wanted to feel connected to him, to the faith he'd stumbled back into at the end. That's when I saw the writing. In the same slanted, rushed scrawl as the letter, but fainter, like the pen was running out of ink. It was written in the margin of the very first page, next to the printed words of the book of Genesis. It was a single, devastating sentence, one that made my newly found peace shudder and the breath catch in my throat. It read, "I pray he finds this, and I pray he can forgive me for the other secret, the one I can never write down, the peace I had felt just moments before shattered like glass." It was so fragile, so new, and now it lay in pieces at my feet. I stared at the words in the margin until they blurred, my mind refusing to process them. The other secret, the one I can never write down. What did that mean? What could be worse than walking out on your wife and child? What secret was so terrible that he could confess to the affair, the abandonment, the decades of silence, but not this? My heart started its old, familiar frantic rhythm. The hollow feeling returned, but this time it was filled with a cold, dread-fueled curiosity. I sank onto my couch, the Bible heavy in my hands. I thought I had reached the end. I had found the apology. I had understood his pain. I had forgiven him. I had found a measure of peace. It was supposed to be over, but it wasn't. It was just another layer, a deeper, darker one. My first reaction was a hot, bitter anger. Of course there was more. The man was a bottomless pit of failure. Just when I thought I had found the whole, sad truth, he revealed there was more ugliness hidden beneath. The forgiveness I had worked so hard to cultivate felt cheap and naive. Had I forgiven too easily? Had I been a fool? I spent the rest of the day in a fog of agitation. I tried to watch TV, but the sounds and images were just noise. I tried to read, but the words meant nothing. That one sentence was a worm in my brain, eating away at my hard-won contentment. The other secret. What could it be? A crime? Another woman before Janet? Some debt I didn't know about? My imagination, fueled by a lifetime of distrust, conjured up terrible scenarios. Each one felt more plausible than the last. The following day, I went back to Pastor Joe. I didn't call ahead. I just showed up at the church, the Bible clutched in my hand. He was in his office, typing on an old computer. He took one look at my face and stopped. "Kyle, what's happened?" I didn't say a word. I just opened the Bible to the first page and pointed to the margin. He put on his reading glasses and leaned close, his brow furrowed. I watched his face as he read it. I saw the slight tightening around his eyes, the quick intake of breath. "Oh my," he murmured. He took off his glasses and looked at me. "Where did you find this?" "Just now. In the front." I'd never looked there before. My voice was tight. "What does it mean, Joe? What other secret?" He sighed, a deep, weary sound. I don't know, Kyle. I truly don't. Did he ever say anything to you? Anything that seemed unfinished? Or strange? Pastor Joe thought for a long moment. He talked about his regret, his shame, but it was always focused on you and your mother. He never hinted at anything else. He leaned forward, his expression earnest. Kyle, you have to ask yourself something. What purpose will it serve to dig this up? You have found peace. You have offered forgiveness. Is this a path you need to go down? He's asking me to, I said, my voice rising. He wrote it in the Bible, Joe. He put it right next to the letter. It's like he wanted me to find it, but he was too much of a coward to actually tell me. Again, the old bitterness was back, tasting like acid in my mouth. Or, Joe said gently, it was a cry of a conscience that was still burdened. A sin he felt was between him and God alone. Not everything is for us to know, Kyle. Some wounds are meant to be healed in the dark. But I couldn't accept that. The not knowing was a poison. It made a mockery of my forgiveness. How could I truly forgive a man when I didn't even know the full extent of what he had done? I left the church more troubled than when I'd arrived. Pastor Joe's wisdom felt like a door being gently closed, but I was already on the other side, in the dark, fumbling for a light switch. I became a man obsessed. I went back to my dad's empty house, which was now just a shell waiting for a realtor's sign. I tore it apart. I looked through every drawer, every box, every book. I pulled up loose floorboards. I checked the attic insulation. I was no longer a son tenderly handling his father's legacy. I was a detective searching for a crime, my hands covered in dust and desperation. I found nothing. No hidden safe. No second, more shocking letter. No cryptic clues. Just the mundane debris of a lonely life. Expired coupons, old receipts, a lifetime of socks with holes in them. The frustration was maddening. The secret was a ghost, haunting me from beyond the grave. It was in the empty silence of the house, in the faded pattern of the wallpaper, in the very air I breathed. It was everywhere and nowhere. A week into my futile search, I sat on the floor of the barren living room, surrounded by the final piles for donation and trash. I was exhausted, spiritually and physically. The high of forgiveness had been replaced by the low of a new, gnawing doubt. Had my father's faith been real? Or was it just another layer of performance, a final, desperate attempt to clean the slate without truly coming clean? I looked at the Bible, which I had brought with me like a cursed artifact. I had thought it was a symbol of his redemption. Now it felt like a lie. In a moment of pure, childish fury, I picked it up and threw it across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thump and landed on the floor, pages splayed. I immediately felt a wave of shame. I was acting like the angry boy again, not the man I wanted to be. I walked over and picked it up, smoothing the crumpled pages. As I did, a small, faded photograph fluttered out from the back of the book. I must have missed it before. It was an old picture, the colors washed out with age. It was a picture of my dad, maybe in his late 20s. He was standing with his arm around a young woman. But it wasn't my mom. This woman had long, dark hair and a bright, easy smile. My dad was looking at her, and he was smiling too. A real, unguarded, happy smile I hadn't seen since I was a very small child. They were standing in front of a waterfall I didn't recognize, looking like two people deeply in love. Written on the back, in my dad's handwriting, was a date from a year before he married my mom. And a name, Catherine. My blood ran cold. This was it. This was the other secret. It wasn't Janet. It was someone else. Someone from before. He had loved someone before my mom. The timeline was wrong. The happiness in the photo was all wrong. It contradicted everything I thought I knew about my parents' early life together. Who was Catherine? What happened to her? And why had he kept her picture hidden in his Bible for over 30 years? The mystery had just deepened, and the path forward was darker than ever. I had a name, but no answers. And the quiet, terrible question now was whether some secrets are better left buried, or if digging them up would destroy the fragile peace I had managed to build and the memory of my mother's happiness forever. The woman in the photograph, Catherine, smiled up at me from the dusty floor. Her face was a stranger's, but my father's face, young, open, genuinely happy, was a punch to the gut. I had convinced myself that his unhappiness with my mom was what led him to Janet. But this picture told a different story. A story of a love that existed long before my mom. A love that looked real. The peace I'd fought for evaporated, replaced by a sickening sense of vertigo. The foundation of my family's history, already cracked, now felt like it was built on sand. Who was my dad? How many layers of secrets were there? I took the photo and drove home in a daze. I placed it on my coffee table next to his Bible, the two objects now seeming to accuse each other. The one I can never write down. Was Catherine the secret? Was she the reason for the deep, lingering sadness my mom had always said was in him? Even at the beginning? For 2 days, I did nothing. I stared at the photo. I tortured myself with questions. The man I had just forgiven was becoming a stranger again, a man with a whole hidden life I knew nothing about. My forgiveness felt flimsy, based on a partial truth. How could I forgive a man I didn't even know? The urge to show my mom was overwhelming. To say, look what he was hiding all along. But I stopped myself. The pain in her eyes when I'd mentioned the letter had been real, but it was tempered by time and her new life. Showing her this picture of a young, vibrant woman her husband had clearly loved before her. That would be cruel. It would be like poisoning her good memories. I couldn't do that to her. This secret was mine to carry, mine to solve. I had to find out who Catherine was. The internet was my first stop. Catherine was a common name. I had no last name, no location, just a face and a date from over 35 years ago. My searches went nowhere. I looked up the waterfall in the background, but it was a generic-looking cascade that could have been in one of 100 state parks. Frustrated, I turned to the only other source I had, the box of my dad's things I'd taken from his house. I dumped it out on my living room floor, not looking for memories anymore, but for clues. I went through every paper, every scrap. I found his high school diploma, his old Army enlistment papers, a manual for a car he'd owned in the 80s. Nothing about a Catherine. Then, at the very bottom of the box, beneath a stack of old pay stubs, I found a small, flat, metal box I'd overlooked before. It was tarnished and locked with a tiny, rusted key that was nowhere to be found. My heart hammered. This felt different. This felt intentional. I didn't have the patience to find the key. I took a flathead screwdriver from my toolkit and, with a sickening crunch of old metal, pried the box open. Inside, there were no more photographs. There were no love letters. There was only a single, yellowed newspaper clipping, folded neatly into a square. My hands were trembling as I unfolded it. It was from the local Canton newspaper. The date was from the same year as the photograph. The headline was small, but it hit me with the force of a physical blow. Local woman killed in single car accident. The article was brief. It stated that Catherine Marie Rossi, 24, of Canton, had died instantly when her car left the road and struck a tree during a heavy rainstorm. It listed her parents' names. It said she was a secretary at a local insurance firm. And at the very end, it included a single, devastating sentence. She is survived by her fiancé, Michael Mitchell. The room spun. I dropped the clipping and stumbled to the bathroom, sure I was going to be sick. I gripped the edges of the sink, staring at my pale, wide-eyed reflection in the mirror. He was engaged. Before my mom. The woman he loved had died. Tragically. Suddenly. This was the secret. The one he could never write down. It wasn't a crime. It wasn't a sordid affair. It was a trauma. A loss so profound it had shaped the rest of his life. The unhappy man my mom married. The man who felt like a failure. The man who eventually ran away from his family. He was a man who had never gotten over the death of his first love. The pieces began to snap together with a clarity that was almost painful. His sadness wasn't a mystery anymore. His inability to be truly present in his new marriage made a terrible sense. He had given my mom and me the shattered pieces of a heart that had never fully healed. He had tried to build a new life on the foundation of a grave. I thought of the letter, of him writing that he was chasing some kind of happiness. He wasn't just chasing a fantasy with Janet. He was chasing the ghost of the happiness he'd lost with Catherine. He was trying to outrun a grief that had been his constant companion for decades. My anger didn't just dissolve this time. It transformed. It became a deep, aching sorrow for him. For the young man in the photograph, whose future was stolen. For the burden of grief he carried alone. A burden so heavy it eventually broke him and everyone around him. I thought of my mom, unknowingly marrying a widower. Had he ever told her? I doubted it. The pain was probably too deep, the wound too fresh when they met. He must have locked it away, and in doing so, he had locked away a part of himself forever. I went back into the living room and picked up the clipping. Catherine Marie Rossi. I had a full name now. I could find her grave. The thought was overwhelming, but it felt necessary. It felt like the final piece of the journey. The next day, I drove to the cemetery listed in the obituary. It was an old, sprawling place on the outskirts of town. I found the Rossi family plot easily enough. And there it was. A simple, weathered headstone. Catherine Marie Rossi, beloved daughter, until we meet again. And carved beneath the dates, smaller, but unmistakable, was a symbol. A simple, engraved ring. My breath caught. Until we meet again. The words of someone waiting for a reunion. The words of a fiancé. I stood there for a long time, the spring wind rustling the leaves of a nearby oak tree. I wasn't standing at the grave of my father's secret. I was standing at the grave of his first heartbreak, the source of his brokenness, the reason for everything that came after. The narrative of my life rewrote itself one final time. My father wasn't just a man who made bad choices. He was a man who was shipwrecked by loss and who never learned how to swim to shore. His affair with Janet wasn't the root of his pain. It was a symptom of a much older, deeper wound. I had come here looking for a secret, and I had found a tragedy. As I turned to leave, a final, heartbreaking thought occurred to me. My father had kept Catherine's picture in his Bible. He had visited her grave. He had held on to this love, this loss, for his entire life. And in the end, he had hidden his apology to me in the very same book. It was as if, in his quiet, confused way, he was placing his two great loves, the one he lost and the one he failed, side by side before God. He was entrusting them both to the same mercy. I got in my car, the weight of his lifelong grief now settling onto my own shoulders. I had the whole story now, every painful, heartbreaking piece of it. The journey was over. But as I looked back at the cemetery through my rearview mirror, I knew the hardest part was still to come. I had to decide what to do with this devastating, complete truth. And I had to find a way to forgive him all over again, not for leaving, but for never being able to stay in the first place. The drive home from the cemetery was a blur. The world outside my car window looked the same streets, the same stores, the same people going about their Saturday, but I felt like I was seeing it all for the first time through a new, heavier lens. I wasn't just Kyle Mitchell, the son who was left. I was Kyle Mitchell, the son of a man who was forever haunted, a man who had been left first. The anger was gone. Truly, finally gone. It had been burned away in the crucible of this new, devastating truth. You can't be angry at a wound. You can only pity it. And that's what my father's life had been. One long, festering wound that he never knew how to heal. I didn't go home. I drove to Pastor Joe's church. He was pulling weeds in the small flower bed beside the front steps when I pulled up. He stood, wiping his hands on his trousers, and his eyes met mine. He didn't look surprised to see me. "You found it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I just nodded, unable to form words. I held out the faded newspaper clipping. He took it, read it slowly, and then closed his eyes for a moment, a pained expression on his face. "Ah, Mike," he whispered, a sigh of deep sorrow. "You carried this all alone." We went inside and sat in the same front pew. The silence felt different this time, reverent, like we were at a funeral for a pain that had finally been laid to rest. He never said a word. I said, my voice hoarse. "All those years. He never told my mom. He never told me. Some grief is too big for words, Kyle," Joe said. "It becomes a part of your bones. It becomes the air you breathe. To speak of it would be to admit that the world had truly, irrevocably changed. For a young man, that can feel like an impossibility." I thought of my dad, a 20-something kid, his whole future ripped away in one rainy night. I thought of him trying to move on, meeting my mom, having me, all while this gaping hole was in the center of his soul. His distance, his sadness, his eventual collapse, it wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation. A reason. I spent my life thinking his leaving was about me. I said that I wasn't good enough, or we weren't good enough. But it was never about us. It was about the war inside him, Joe said. A war that started long before you were born. You and your mother were just the collateral damage. Collateral damage. The words were harsh, but they were true. We were the innocent bystanders hit by the shrapnel of his unresolved grief. "What do I do with this, Joe?" I asked, the question a plea. "I have this huge, sad knowledge. It feels too heavy to carry." "You don't carry it," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "You lay it down. You lay his burden down right here, right at the foot of the cross. It was never yours to carry in the first place. Your forgiveness was the first step. Now comes the grace. The grace to understand that his story was always more complicated than you knew, and the grace to let that complexity simply be, without it destroying you. I sat there for a long time after Pastor Joe left me to my thoughts. I thought about Catherine. I thought about my mom. I thought about the man my father could have been if tragedy hadn't stolen his light. And I thought about the man I was, now that I knew. A quiet conviction grew in me. This wasn't an end. It was a new beginning. My father's story of brokenness didn't have to be the end of mine. It could be the foundation for something stronger. His life was a warning of what happens when you let grief and shame fester in the dark. Mine could be a testimony of what happens when you drag them into the light and let grace do its healing work. I knew what I had to do. I drove to my mom's house. Bill's car was in the driveway. I walked up the steps, my heart steady for the first time in months. I knocked. My mom opened the door, her smile warm but cautious. "Kyle, this is a surprise. Come in, honey." "Actually, Mom," I said, my voice clear and calm. "Can we sit on the porch for a minute?" We sat on the same porch where I'd watched my dad drive away. The same porch where I'd made my vow of bitterness. It felt like the most fitting place in the world to break it for good. "I found out something else about Dad," I began. She started to speak, a protective look in her eyes, but I held up a hand. "It's okay. It's not what you think. It's from before you." I told her everything. About the photo, about Catherine, about the accident, about the engagement. I spoke softly, without drama, just laying out the facts of a tragedy that happened decades ago. I watched her face as I spoke. The caution melted into confusion, then into dawning comprehension, and finally, into a profound, deep sadness. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, looking out at the street. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. "All this time," she whispered. "All this time, I thought it was me. I thought I wasn't pretty enough, or fun enough, or enough of something to make him happy." She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a grief that was 35 years overdue. "He was always so sad. Even at the beginning. I just thought that's who he was." "It was who he was, Mom," I said gently. "But it wasn't because of you. He was a broken man who loved you as well as he could, but he never got whole again." She reached over and took my hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for telling me, Kyle. It actually helps. In a strange way, it heals an old hurt of my own." She squeezed my fingers. "What he did was still wrong. Leaving us was still his choice. But I think I understand the weight of that choice a little better now." We sat there together, mother and son, holding hands on the porch, finally sharing the same truth about the man who had shaped our lives through his absence. The chain of misunderstanding and pain, stretching back generations, had finally been broken. I drove home as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The heavy weight was gone. Pastor Joe was right. I had laid it down. I had given my father's grief back to him, and in doing so, I had given myself my future. I walked into my quiet apartment. I picked up my dad's Bible and Catherine's photograph. I didn't look at them with anger or even sadness anymore. I looked at them with a quiet reverence. These were the artifacts of a sacred pain. They were not my cross to bear. I had the whole story. The betrayal, the search, the apology, the secret, the tragedy. Every last piece. The journey that began with a hidden letter was over. But as I placed the Bible and the photograph gently in the box with my father's other things, I knew one thing for certain. My story was just beginning. And for the first time, I was excited to see what would be written on the next page. The page I got to write for myself, not as a wounded son, but as a free man. A man who had learned that the deepest valleys of pain can, with time and grace, lead to the most solid ground. The box sat on my shelf for a week. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The Bible, the letter, the tractor, the photo of Catherine, they were no longer ghosts in my house. They were just objects. Their power over me was gone because I had finally, fully, understood their story. And in understanding theirs, I had begun to write my own. Life didn't become magically perfect. There were no angels singing. But the colors stayed bright. The silence in my apartment stayed friendly. I started actually listening on that date with the woman from work. Her name was Chloe, and we laughed about stupid, normal things. It felt light. On Sunday, I didn't have to force myself to go to church. I wanted to go. I walked in, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an imposter or a wounded seeker. I felt like I was coming home. I didn't sit in the back, or or the middle. I walked right up to the second row. When the music started, I sang, and my voice, while still off-key, felt like a genuine offering. After the service, I waited for Pastor Joe. He was shaking hands with a little old lady, and when he saw me, his face broke into a wide, genuine smile. "Kyle," he said, pulling me into a quick, surprising hug. "You look solid." "I feel it," I said, and I meant it. "I wanted to thank you. For everything. For not giving me easy answers. For letting me wrestle with it. That's what faith is, son," he said, his eyes twinkling. "It's not a set of answers. It's a God who isn't afraid of our questions." He looked at me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You know, your father's story, it's a tragedy. But your story? It doesn't have to be. His ending can be your beginning." That stuck with me. His ending can be your beginning. A few days later, I was cleaning out my junk drawer, a real, present-day task for my new, present-day life, when I found a pad of blank paper. Not a fancy journal, just a simple, cheap notepad. I picked it up and a thought, clear and calm, settled in my mind. I sat down at my kitchen table, the morning sun streaming in, and I wrote at the top of the first page, things I want to build. It wasn't a bucket list. It wasn't a dream board. It was a blueprint. I wrote down simple, tangible things. Learn to cook a real meal. Call mom twice a week just to talk. See if Chloe wants to get coffee again. Read the Gospel of John, not out of obligation, but curiosity. I was building a new foundation, one deliberate choice at a time. The old one, made of bitterness and a dead man's secrets, was gone. The most surprising thing was the compassion that started to grow in me, like a green shoot in cracked earth. I thought about my dad not with anger or even pity, but with a quiet, respectful sorrow. I thought about him as a young man, full of hope, his life shattered in an instant. I thought about him as a middle-aged man, drowning in a regret he couldn't voice. And I thought about him as an old man, finding his way back to a flicker of faith, brave enough to write a letter, but still too wounded to deliver it. He did the best he could with the broken tools he had. It wasn't enough for our family, but it was his best. And finally, after a lifetime of rage, I found that I could accept that. One evening, I took the little green tractor out of the box. I held it in my hand, its plastic cool and familiar. I didn't see a symbol of lost love anymore. I saw a toy that a little boy loved, and a father who, in his own broken way, loved enough to keep it. It was a small, good thing in a story filled with pain. I decided to keep it on my windowsill, a reminder that even in the darkest stories, there are fragments of light. I looked around my apartment. It was the same place, but it was different. It was mine. The past was no longer a landlord charging me rent and paying. I was free. The story that began with a hidden letter, a lifetime of silence, and a secret grave had ended. It ended not with a bang, but with a quiet sigh of release. It ended with forgiveness that cost me my oldest, dearest possession, my grudge. It ended with a redemption that didn't change the past, but utterly transformed the future. My father died without apologizing, until I found his letter. And in finding it, I found so much more. I found his pain, I found his loss, and in the end, I found the key to my own prison. I closed the notepad. The sun was warmer now. Outside, a bird was singing. It was just a Tuesday, but it was my Tuesday. A day in a life that was no longer defined by a goodbye on a porch, but by the countless, quiet hellos of a future being built, one grace-filled moment at a time. The testimony was over. The living had just begun.